welcome one and all to Solutions House. This is the first time that Solutions House has come to London. I've got a really bad joke, which is we thought about renaming it Let's Sit Down with a Cuppa and Fix Climate Change House, because it was coming to the UK. Thank you, Solly, for laughing. Thank you. She has to do it every time. But no, it's still Solutions House, and that's because Solutions House it's not just a name, it's a promise. All of our solutions working together to beat paralysis with possibility, to jump over crisis with creativity, and to work together with that wonderful collective action spirit of mutual to take us up to COP30 and beyond. I'm Lucy Shea, I'm the CEO of Futera, and Futera is a sustainability advisory. We do spheres of influence, which is our next panel. We do climate transition action plans, we do new narratives and positioning, and I'm also a trustee of Futera Solutions Union, which is our independent non-profit working as culture hackers for climate action. We are so very grateful to Unilever for hosting Solutions House in London for the very first time. Now, woo! And we have Hannah from Unilever on the panel next. But I would like to say, we do know that Unilever are real leaders in corporate climate action. But did you know that the Futera and Unilever teams working together could also pull an event off in 4 weeks, start to finish? So thank you, teams. I'd also like to extend the warmest and deepest thanks to our key and founding partners, that's Netflix and Google and the Exponential Roadmap, and we really, really value that partnership. We have the most amazing set of sessions at Futera. At Solutions House. We've had at the start with a special live recording of a podcast. We've had this panel on climate competitiveness. We've had ones on sports and health, and now one very dear to my heart on spheres of influence and how the definition and the frame of corporate climate action is evolving. So we've got the most brilliant panel to talk about us there, and Solly, our co-founder at Futera. Do you want to come up to the stage and then you can introduce everyone else?
Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lucy's also lent me her iPad, which means she did all of that without notes, which is brilliant. So I've got a great panel that I'm going to bring up here in a second, but what we've decided is that I have like 4 slides that I'm allowed to give. I'm the only person giving slides in the whole of Solutions House today, but because what I said was it's going to take me like 25 minutes to explain this, or I could do a picture instead. So this is called Spheres of Influence. What the hell is a sphere of influence? So let me see if I can go forward. So we have got a lot of carbon we have got to try to reduce. A lot more than we thought we would have at this point, because we actually haven't done enough. However, if you calculate up every single company that has committed to net zero as it currently stands, even if they all manage to hit all of their targets, we are still fucked. Because it's cute. I'm allowed to swear once on every panel. And bluntly, we need to say we're fucked if we don't think so. Oh no, that was twice. We need to be honest about the fact that whilst the current conception of net zero is necessary and absolute and extremely challenging for companies to meet, it still doesn't take into account everything that's happening in society. The way in which society functions, the way in which the economy functions, tends not to be just about what happens within a company or within its value chain. It tends to happen about its spheres of influence as well. So we all know what scopes 1, scopes 2 and scopes 3 mean. But is that it? Is that everything that a company can do or should be expected to do on climate? And so this is where very much the brainchild of Kaya, who I'll introduce in a moment from Oxford Net Zero, with Claire from Exponential Roadmap and many others, where this thought was that if we could think about how businesses actually operate, how they function within society rather than in a castle all of their own, then perhaps we might think about their scopes inventory, which is their absolute responsibility. There's no getting out of that. Also, there's no netting these things off or being able to say, well, we'll do loads on our spheres of influence, which means we don't have to do scopes. No, you absolutely freaking have to do your scopes. But there are other ways that actually you could recognise, celebrate, encourage companies to do more within society, which, by the way, might make it possible for them to actually hit their scopes. I was sitting with a board just a couple of weeks ago where they were saying, we don't think we can hit our targets. We don't think we're going to be able to do it. We can't hit a 90% absolute reduction by 2050. We're not even sure we can hit a 50% reduction within 2050. This is literally impossible. I said, well, what if in the markets where you primarily manufacture and operate, the grid was completely decarbonised and transportation was decarbonised by about 50%, would you be able to do it then? Like if society was decarbonised, would you be able to hit your net zero targets? They're like, oh yeah, we could do it then. It's like going, then you're going to have to get out there and help decarbonise society. You're going to have to use your spheres of influence within society in order to be able to meet your scope inventory. And just like yin yang, these things should be able to complement each other. We can go into this in a little bit more detail, that scopes are your organisational net zero, whereas spheres is global net zero. And let's remember that the entire concept of net zero was originally designed for the whole planet. It's a scientific engineering concept rather than something which was necessarily supposed to apply to businesses. It's within, your scopes are within value chain, your spheres are beyond value chain. Your scopes are primarily attributional accounting, your spheres might include consequential accounting. And these are what the spheres of influence are as Futerra, our agency in Oxford Net Zero, have currently conceived of them. That we would have sphere A, which is products and services, that might, I'll show you some things that might include in a moment. Sphere B, which is your portfolio, the money bit. And sphere C, which is policy and public engagement, something which just this morning Unilever was talking about, and hopefully they might be able to expand upon. Now, the next slide, I'm actually going to ask you to take your phones down for, and because the next slide is not yet public. So in about a month, we're going to publish a white paper that shares some of this in detail, but some of this stuff is already out there in the world. The next slide is what some of the subspheres, what some of the specifics might be underneath these, which is why it's less pretty and less designed up than the rest of it. So for example, under sphere A, definitely some of the work around avoided emissions, where companies are enabling through their products and services wider societal change. It might involve the amount of money that companies invest in their R&D. Because at the moment, if you invested in R&D for climate solutions, you can only count that once that solution's out in the world and making enough difference to be counted. Whereas we really need to encourage companies to be proud of and to talk about and to do more R&D on sustainability. In sphere B, credits, offsets and insets, that's beyond your residual emissions from net zero. That's what was often called beyond value chain mitigation, investing in credits that are beyond what you're required to do. Climate-aligned financial mechanisms, system enablement, climate solutions, and crucially, advanced market mechanisms, where you're committing to buy renewable energy over a period of time, when you're investing in some of these solutions before they've come to market, when you're giving that kind of guarantee to some of these massive infrastructure programs that you will be there and you will buy that energy once it's on the market. And of course, what you can see with sphere B3 is that once all of that energy is on the market, once that advanced market commitment has turned into actual energy you can buy, then it pops off your spheres and it goes onto your scopes. It goes onto your scope 2. So you can see how this becomes fulfillment. And then sphere C, policy advocacy, market transformation. industry engagement in climate action, and empowerment via public discourse and advocacy. There's a whole load more underneath these. In the white paper, we'll share some of those later on. But what you can see with this work that we're trying to do is get to a point where there's a little bit of structure, where there's a little bit of framework around all the things that companies do on climate that are beyond their current scopes. And so scopes and spheres, not scopes or spheres, and hella not scopes offset by spheres. No, none of that, thank you, oil companies. What you still have to do, you still have to actually do the work. So what we're going to have a conversation about today, and I'm going to ask the panel to come up now, is we're going to talk about spheres a bit, but also this is a really new idea, and it's still growing, and it's not done yet. So we're also going to talk about the principles and the ideas and the actions that companies can take, which are far beyond the current definition of net zero, and how we incentivize them to do that as well, because nobody needs another reporting requirement. So come on up. If we could have Kaya Axeltham from Oxford Net Zero, if we could have Hannah Hislop, the head of sustainability at Unilever, if we can have Anna Terrell, the board of trustees at SBTI. I'm going to come and sit in the green chair because it looks really comfy. If we could have Caroline Reid, the senior sustainability director at Oatly. So. Oh, we have a whole female panel. Obviously we do. This is thought leadership, darling. I read a piece of research earlier that said women in mainly male fields, women experts in mainly male fields are very highly regarded because apparently we had to work harder to get here. So there we go. So as a you don't snort your water up, you know. So Kaya, I just did a very, very radically oversimplified definition of spheres, and you were probably sitting there saying, no, sorry, not that word, and be careful not to say inventory. So please, could you build on what I just took through in those quick slides, perhaps a little bit about why Oxford Net Zero and you in particular have been pushing for some of this, because you've been so involved in scopes themselves. Yeah. So you have been an absolute advocate and powerhouse of making scopes happen. Why have you now been thinking about this work beyond scopes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to say that it's been really partly your influence, speaking of influence. I've been working on definitions of net zero, translating from the science, whether that's physical science, anthropology, law, economics. I lead a team that does that work, writing the standards, ISO, SBTI, GHG protocol at the University of Oxford. And I've been swimming in the net zero challenges and opportunities since sort of companies first started pledging them. And it took me a long time to realize that kind of what you showed on that bubble photo, that we really can't get to the kind of scopes if we don't do the work around them. I heard a great quote the other day that culture is upstream of policy. And as someone who works on policy, because I like to be really direct, I like to see the outcome. I call it red pen activism. I get my red pen out and I can see the change in front of me, or I negotiate with someone and I see the language come together through compromise. But we have so much work to do, as we've seen with the shifting political headwinds that make all of our jobs harder. I was at a wedding this weekend. I know, I promise you it's relevant. I was at my sister's wedding this weekend. I cried through the entire thing. It was a beautiful storytelling exercise. And I feel that we've taken the ritual, the myth, the emotion out of sustainability in a way that is really a sacrifice to all of us doing our jobs. And if we are not sustained, I'm not sure how others, can join us. Movements are all about joining and being a part of something. And we need to grow ours as fast as we can so that our spheres of influence are as wide as they can be. So what was really important to our team when we came to Soli and the team and started thinking about, what do we call this? These things are not spheres. I work on the greenhouse gas accounting side, and one of the things we really worry about is the way that consumers or investors or policymakers will have a hard time comparing companies' emissions if companies' emissions are sort of muddled or confounded with two types of research questions. If you are, purchasing a credit, or if you are doing avoided emissions through the use of your products, those really important things that we do want companies to do, that is asking and answering a fundamentally different research question about what that impact is from the inventory reductions, which have a very kind of careful system, as you all know, as to how do we account for those. So by keeping them separate ledgers, we avoid the risks that I know companies are also afraid of in terms of accidentally misleading consumers, accidentally greenwashing. And we realized, more importantly, created this huge opportunity to talk about impact and to label it. Now, the power of language is something, the power of just even the word sphere is something that I believe in, not just because I like playing with language, I think many of us do, but because it's evidence-based. There's a study that showed that censusing led to entirely new ethnic groups in certain countries that led to, in some cases, civil war, simply because people started labeling themselves certain things. So when you give a name to something, it has power. Another great example is if you allow someone to self-identify, right? They suddenly feel more themselves. This is the arguments that we're having in my country around gender identity. It is not just a nice kind of concept, oh, you can sort of wrap this up and create a strategy and remarket some of the things you're already doing. No, we want to create strategy with the spheres in order for you to see how you can leverage the power of your products to drive emissions down in society, not just efficiency gains at the margins, the power of your purchases, your portfolio, your R&D, the high integrity NBS you support. We want to see all of that wrapped up into one thing we can celebrate rather than retrenching this offsetting debate that everyone is sick of. And we want to see the power of your policy engagement and your public affairs teams and your marketing teams even. I saw that might be more in the products and services sphere, it depends on where your marketing team sits. But I saw some figures recently, some of the tech companies have $20 billion in their marketing. I mean, that's money that we're leaving on the table if we're just talking about scope 1, 2, and 3. So it's time for us to think holistically about how companies can be corporate citizens on climate and not just leave a footprint, but also a climate legacy.
Brilliant, thank you so much. You said I told you to do it better than me. Woo! So, Hannah, spheres is an emergent idea. We've got the white paper coming out in about a month. But what's inside spheres, what's within those spheres of influence is nothing new. Something that companies have been doing for a long time, that they've had the work that they've been doing to reduce their inventory, but there's always been other stuff. And in fact, this morning, Rebecca, the CSO here, was talking about the big focus that Unilever has on policy and on advocacy. We're trying to get to, why do you do that? If all you're required to do, if all you've committed to do is reduce your scopes inventory, why are you doing this more global net zero work?
Sure, so absolutely. So, I mean, Unilever has, this is kind of so embedded in our DNA, and I think it almost kind of predates some of the GHG protocol kind of very precise accounting of, this is our responsibility, this isn't. So, you can go all the way back to 2010 to the kind of conversations around our Sustainable Living Plan, which was our first big corporate sustainability plan. And in that, we put in a target which was to reduce our emissions of our products across the value chain by 2020. That was one of our original targets. And so, that encompassed things like consumer use, of our products, etc. So it kind of predated net zero as a concept as well. It was a sort of, a different era. And I think because of that approach, we've always had this kind of, assumption that the global transition to net zero, the global climate transition before net zero was a kind of buzzword, is incredibly important to Unilever, and there's incredible advantages to being early. And so that showed up in our first USLP target, but it's also shown up in the way that we've kind of led. In policy advocacy and leadership, it shows up in the way that we were, a co-founder of the Tropical Forest Alliance, for example, in our support of the UK government at COP26 in Glasgow. In our first climate transition action plan, we actually had something called what we called our onion model, and it was kind of a bit equivalent to your spheres model, to be honest. It was sort of showing our kind of concentric circles of influence. So we had our operations, very much under our own control in the centre of this onion, and then we had our supply chain as the second layer. Then we had our brands and kind of how we could reach consumers through kind of climate innovations and more sustainable products. And then the outer circle was our kind of influence on society. And that didn't make it into the updated CTAP, which we launched last year, because in that CTAP, we got a lot more granular, as Rebecca was saying earlier, about our emissions and where they sit in our value chain. But we also, when we went through each of these buckets of emissions, kind of 10 main buckets, we actually set out our dependencies for each category. So not just in kind of policy and advocacy, but in kind of, whole sectoral shifts that would need to at least be underway for us to meet our targets. And so I think, now we're in a kind of situation now where, we're deeply committed to achieving our climate targets, but we also know that those targets are not going to insulate us from systemic climate risk. And we know that if we want to address that risk collectively, and we want all companies to be better insulated, then we're going to have to incentivize, find ways of encouraging businesses to use the whole suite of options available to them across their spheres, across whatever you call it, essentially, to do that.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for reminding me that this idea actually predates net zero. Thinking back to the late 90s, where I was working as a consultant at BT, British Telecom, who was actually one of the massive pioneering companies on sustainability in the early days. And we were working with the Global E-Sustainability Initiative, Jessie, about this sense of going at the time, feels very different now, but at the time, the comms tech world didn't have a very big footprint, but it had this massive opportunity to enable. And so we built some of this spheres thinking in back then. So yes, spheres predates net zero. There we go. You heard it here first. And Hannah, also that you make very well that case that without engaging in societal net zero, it becomes incredibly difficult for companies to hit their actual inventory targets. That sort of, we make this together or we don't make it at all, kind of thinking. And I think too many companies have now become very myopic and navel-gazing on trying to hit their own targets, rather than realising that that's either not possible or also not relevant if we don't hit societal net zero. Thank you so much. Anna, coming to you, obviously I introduced you as a member of the Board of Trustees of SBTI, but of course you've also been all the leadership that you were doing at Decathlon and CSO, which were also very much within this space, as I know well. So where is your head at the moment in terms of global net zero? So I'm not asking you to endorse spheres, we're not actually quite ready for that. But I know that there's been a lot of thinking that's been going on about how do we make sure that some of the first principles about why we were doing this in the first place, because I know that the SBTI and others really gave this a lot of thought, those first principles don't get lost in the maths, basically, and the trying to hit your targets.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, the kind of quick response is, my head is at right now. So, look, I think it's really bloody difficult, right? And I think inherently companies are not wired to think collectively and collaboratively. They are wired to produce and to sell, or some variation of a theme. And so very quickly, those corporate value chains, to your point, they become these silos that become really entrenched, practice as well as ideology. And I think we have to do a better job at speaking truth to power and calling bullshit on it, to be honest. Because for all of what we've heard, right, we do not deliver on net zero as companies unless we deliver on net zero, period. But to be able to do that and thinking about kind of spheres requires companies to really put themselves out of their comfort zone. Companies are terrible at engagement, particularly policy engagement. Unilever is by far and away an exception. But most companies, they either don't get it, they don't care to get it, they don't have the resource or the capacity to get it. And to be quite honest, if they've got a list of priorities that they're going to lobby on, it's going to be trade, competitiveness, all of that, kind of same old. So we also collectively have got to do a better job at knitting together the kind of causality, right? Because this is so interconnected. This is not separate. We've just heard this. Like, you do not you will not have business in the future if you are not delivering on this stuff. So, you know, I guess that's my starting point, which is it's bloody difficult. Companies are not inherently wired to do this stuff. We have got to force it. And having systems thinking, having these kind of big new approaches to put on the table to test and learn from, but to hold the conversation and hold the tension, I think is really important, because influence needs to drive accountability at the collective level. Now, if I flip it from the SBTI perspective, and I'm really not here in an official capacity, but at the same time with my SBTI kind of trustee hat on, I think, you know, SBTI is going through a process at the moment, consulting on the latest, the second version of the corporate net zero standard. But this is very much part of the conversation, right? Which is, how do we actually kind of explode out beyond the kind of core framework, the scopes that we know so well, and those methodologies that are grounded so much in science, and actually start to think about real world application that moves the needle beyond just a bunch of companies submitting targets for verification and then off we go again. So it's there. I think it's super nascent, and for organizations like SBTI that are designed to create standards and frameworks that reinforce almost the structure, I think it's really tricky. But I guess the last thing I would say is then we have to collectively do a better job at understanding the different roles and responsibilities that we all have to play, because everyone has a place in this, SBTI included. So I'm super excited about what's to come with this Spheres work. I think it's super important, but my kind of collective ask is, like, we have to speak truth to power and call bullshit, because it will breed a bunch of like noise.
Oh yeah, I won't tell you who the first businesses were that phoned us to say, hey, this Spheres thing, can I offset it against my scopes? And the answer was, fuck off. Oh my God, that's the fourth F word. This video is never making it online. Coming to a company that is very good at speaking truth to power, and was one of the first companies to call us and wanted to do this in the right way, Caroline from Oatly. When you called up and said, we're going to do a Sphere strategy, I was like, but we actually haven't worked out what spheres are yet. We were just blown away. And we're like going, okay, would you let us basically come and play with you, and rather than using spheres to test Oatly, would you use Oatly to test spheres and to see whether there's anything here? Because you already do so much. Your whole business is based on trying to make that sort of societal shift. And so incredibly grateful that you gave us the opportunity to work with you. And if I can say, Oatly is the first company to produce and publish a spheres strategy outline. So thank you very much for that. And they did it in pink, which was awesome. And they do deserve a round of applause for that. And they did it before we worked out what the actual subspheres were under these spheres. So, and in fact, working with you helped us do so. So could you say a little bit about what motivated you to take a look at some of this area? And of course, you already have your own ways of thinking about this. Perhaps you could say a word about the experience of working with spheres.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, maybe to start with, I mean, Oatly exists because the food system's broken and we need to transform the food system, right? And we can't do that alone as an oat milk company. We need to do it by influencing and changing society. And so for a long time, Oatly's had climate solutions, significantly less impactful than cow's milk, right? And we've used, if you're aware of Oatly as a brand, you understand we have a voice, then we use it, and we use it in provocative ways, but we use it to really drive positive change, right? So we were using our influence already out there to contribute towards global net zero, societal net zero. And then I heard you guys speak at the panel in New York Climate Week. We were updating our sustainability strategy, and I thought, brilliant, this is the opportunity. Why did I think that? I mean, the starting point was, yes, we were setting our more long-term climate reduction targets. We were building out our pathways, and then we had all these like other climate commitments, kind of just tagging along, and which we've done for ages, right, with advocacy and our avoided emissions, but they were kind of just there, and so. When I heard about this framework being developed, I reached out because I was like, this is an opportunity to kind of codify what Oatly does, but also to shine a light on what not only Oatly and Unilever and maybe the more forward-thinking companies are doing, but what all companies need to be doing more of. So that was the starting point. the process. I think it was a really fun process. I think we played together and we learned a lot together. I tried to think of 3 learnings because I always think it helps to think about 3 things that stick. The first was we knew we were doing a lot within the spheres of influence space, right? So we kind of just thought we would plug in our commitments and actions and it would just sort of fit in this nice framework. But the first realization was like, oh, we're actually doing a lot more in the spheres of influence than we even were aware of. And also there's some more we can be doing that we're not thinking about. So that was really the first sort of learning for us as we were building this out. One example was in the sort of in the portfolio sphere. Yes, we've been working on regenerative agriculture and scaling that up, but we weren't really reflecting on kind of more that how we could, the landscape approach could really, how we were using our influence to drive that more landscape approach in regenerative agriculture. And it was coming down to as simple things as, oh right, we're going to open source our regenerative farm framework, which is Oatly's developed. That is using our influence and contributing to the societal net zero, right? So that was really one learning. The second was that it's really not that easy to create quite sharp targets, especially in the sort of policy and advocacy space. We've been using our voice for a long time to influence policy, but when you're actually like, okay, but what is that actual target? It really challenged us. So I mean, I think that was also it was another learning. And then the third learning was that, or not learning, but even Oatly, a company that's always used its voice and its product to drive change and go way beyond our own kind of scopes, it was so clear that this framework also gives some kind of additional credibility to the teams, right? To the public affairs teams, to our creatives. We don't have a marketing team, but to our creatives. Like realizing that it's not just focusing on the action to reduce our footprint, but by really the actions and the commitments we have in these influence space, it's going to fit into a framework and it's going to be kind of as recognized externally as our footprint reduction, kind of scopes reporting. That actually gave them like a feeling of sort of pride that, yeah, we're on the right track. So there was a number of really interesting learnings internally as we went through this process.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And it was also really fun. You're a great team.
It was, thank you very much. Although we did do quite a lot of kind of going, wow, do we have a target that we can suggest to them? So, and again, enormous respect to Oatly. We have a number of other pilot companies that are working with us on piloting this idea, not to test them, but for them to test spheres. And that's all a bit behind closed door. But Oatly was like, they met us in September in New York and we're like, yeah, and we're going to publish this in like,
I think our initial it was January.
It was January.
We got
next year. Okay. So thank you for accelerating the process. I've got a quick second question for each of you, but then I want to come to the audience. So Kaya, I'm going to come to you. Of the people, and particularly the companies that have taken a look at spheres, many of them, about 75%, have been like, oh, brilliant, because exactly what you're saying, this gives structure to a lot of stuff that we're already doing, and just to be clear, a lot of stuff they're already doing with other people. So WBCSD have got their fantastic work that they're doing on avoided emissions, no desire to replace any of that, we can just plug it into spheres. Influence Map, or the incredible work that they're doing around how you encourage drink policy. Not going to replicate that, just going to validate it and give it to hopefully uplift it all. So about 75% of companies have been like, great, this gives structure. About 15% of companies have been like, oh crap, is this something else I've got to report on? So how do we, like, and also, is there going to be a carbon number that comes out of this? Are we going to be measuring carbon on the sphere side? So maybe you could say a little bit around, is this going to be another reporting requirement, and is it going to be carbon?
Ooh, the hard questions for me.
By the way, neither of us entirely know the answer of that yet, so we're still working through it.
I think that the answer is that we think about this every day because I have a role that I don't work on new initiatives. I work on initiatives that build on and integrate with existing governance landscape. And I think we should all have that rule, otherwise we would waste a lot less time. But it's really, really hard because people always want a shiny new thing. We're like squirrels, we kind of look around, we're like, oh, I'm excited by that. And so being deeply embedded in the net zero governance landscape, I have regular conversations with the technical teams at SBTI about how this docks into the work that they're doing, how you can have an SBTI validated target and then the spheres can built around it as part of your BVCM framework, as part of how, let's say you have excess removals. Microsoft has spent way more on removals than they possibly are going to need for their residual emissions. So that goes over onto the spheres ledger. The landscape community has been doing this forever, right? Like this idea that you would have A and B targets goes back to the sort of SBTN targets. So I could get really nerdy on all the little categories of things that we've taken that didn't have a home in other frameworks, whether that's in accounting frameworks or whether that's in the ISO system, and we've given it a home. I will say that the ISO net zero standard that I also work on is allowed to be, we intentionally wrote the scope to be broader than just sort of target setting, because we wanted there to be kind of the scopes and then this other category. There's really high demand from companies to be recognized for these kinds of things separately. And that has been a really hard and interesting conversation within the ISO community of largely a bunch of greenhouse gas accounting experts who have been doing this for like 40 years and have way more experience than I, working with companies, getting them to see that companies are sort of chomping at the bit and telling the stories of the companies I talk to every day about what we want to reward and how that is, to your point, tied to the external dependencies in their transition plans. If I were to say there's one really clear docking space for this work, it's that companies are developing their first transition plans and they're realizing, we just wrote a paper in Oxford on those external dependencies, and they're all over the place. And so spheres, I haven't yet found an external dependency that can't be tackled by one of the spheres or subcategories of the spheres. So just like when you're going in your scope 1, 2, and 3, and you've got like category 11 or category 13, we're developing it in the same way. It's, category sphere A, category 2, and then that's kind of how you talk about it and how you say, oh, this is different. I wonder how this company over here is dealing with, the product sphere of category 3. And I think it's not another reporting framework. It's just a helpful strategic tool at this stage. But I will say it's getting pickup across the standards. So if you want to get ahead, go ahead and use it.
Excellent. Anna, I'm going to jump to you and ask you a similar question, which is, as SBTI goes through this thinking about how to make sure that this work that we're doing is exciting and about making change and about making impact, not making reports, how do we navigate that? How do we get sustainability back to change making rather than paying Deloitte a lot of money to review your report?
It's such a great question. And I've been having this conversation with the SBTI team recently because I'm a firm believer in occupying the space and using the convening power that you might have or the identity that you might have within that community to convene conversation, to hold the conversation. And a little bit to what you were just saying, right, in terms of the spheres, things like avoided emissions, maybe some of the more super nascent stuff around carbon removals, for example. All of this stuff we need to be discussing, exploring, contributing to, but it doesn't necessarily have to sit in a standard. And I guess and this is a personal view, so my kind of guidance to SBTI has been, you keep true to what you do because it's important and it's needed right now, but create the space to enable those conversations to explore and to learn and to really feel able to not have the answers, right? But just to be engaging in the process. I guess the flip side for me, and maybe this is going to sound a little controversial, I personally think we are so awash with standards and frameworks and methodologies now that I would really welcome this space to actually just enable us to kind of move through it, right? Because again, inherently companies particularly are hardwired to go to kind of to systems and processes and structures and stuff like that. So if we, through this process, end up kind of creating more structure upon structure, I think we'll be going down a slightly different route to perhaps where we want to get to. But I really welcome the opportunity to just hold the space, to have the exploration, the discussion, to learn, and to take that forward.
Holding space for spheres, I think that is absolutely awesome. I've got a whole Wicked thing going on in my head at the moment. Hannah and Caroline, as Anna referenced, Sphere C, the policy and public engagement sphere is probably one of the ones where the most impact can be made, and also the ones which companies are the most anxious about and which we're getting the most questions about in terms of, do we have to do Sphere C and how would we do it? We've got two of the companies on this sofa who actually do this really well. Putting the whole concept of spheres to the side, do you have a word of advice for companies about beginning to approach thinking about policy engagement, particularly in what is quite a challenging moment out there? Maybe come to Unilever. How do you decide your policy and your advocacy strategy?
Sure. So I think, as I said before, Unilever's taken this approach for quite a long time. And I think we got to a point where we realised that, it was relatively straightforward to kind of do sort of global public policy advocacy, to sign the letters, to show up, etc. And that's obviously super, super important. But I think the shift that we made when we came up with our updated CTAP last year was to really link it to these dependencies in each of these decarbonisation categories, and to say, okay, so, in regenerative agriculture, in forest risk commodities, in chemical feedstocks, in logistics, etc., what are the unlocks that we need in all of these things? And actually then that obviously, that grounds it much more in the business. You don't just have the sustainability team kind of running off to COPs or Davos or whatever. You also have them, talking to the business. What are the barriers? What are the challenges? And then you end up with those actually kind of grounding themselves in particular markets and regions as well. So it really kind of is where the rubber hits the road in terms of kind of implementation. And then you get the links to country NDCs, as we were talking about earlier in the day. So I think it's kind of making it as kind of rooted to the decarbonisation challenges that you're having as much as possible. And then I think the second thing that we've done is that we haven't just sort of seen it as a what Unilever does thing. We've seen it as a what Unilever does and our influence beyond that, particularly with our trade associations and our industry groups that we're a member of. And so that's why for the second year running this year we published our climate policy engagement review, which is an independent assessment of 26 of our major trade associations and the extent to which they are aligned with our climate policy. And the brilliant thing about that is that the number of kind of internal conversations that then catalyzes with the relationship manager between Unilever and the industry association. And it's been a really fascinating process, and I think that kind of, that it's been as well something that has really impressed people. People are just like, wow, that's brilliant that you've done that. And so it's been a really kind of positive thing to do, and it's really kind of built the relationships with the trade associations much more as well, and got them much more focused again on our decarbonisation challenges.
Brilliant. And if you haven't seen that, I would really encourage people to review some of that work, which is absolutely agenda setting, and also, if I may say, may also be making some conversations happen in some of those trade associations as well.
Yeah.
And Caroline, same, there's so much that Oatly has been doing, and also in terms of public engagement and trying to see if we can turn the dial on some of that.
Yeah, exactly. So Oatly, firstly, we're so clear on what is it we're trying to achieve, right? We want to transform the food system. It's a completely level playing field right now, unfair. Policy is set up for the kind of incumbent existing industries in the food system. So, one thing Oatly has done is we've created, in many countries, plant-based alliances, because we need a voice beyond ourselves. So how do we come together with the kind of plant-based or plant-based food and drink industry to use our voice more actively? We have really clearly listed out, these are our kind of 12 prioritized policy areas. So we're really kind of focused also on what we are trying to drive change with. But then we also go way beyond kind of the traditional advocacy. So we have used community and society, for example, not used them, but we have engaged community and society, for example, when we think there is completely bizarre regulation, for example, being proposed or out there, to do petitions, for example. How do we actually get societal voice and raise it so we can actually bring that to change policy? But also beyond just sort of the policy sphere, we want to engage citizens, right? We are all part of the food system. We all eat and drink. So we just use our voice to also create the awareness of the impact of food and drinks we eat. And we've done that, for example, we've advocated for mandatory climate labelling on all food and drink for many years. We've also put it on pack. Why have we done that? To also just raise the awareness in us as citizens as what are we choosing to put in our bodies and what's the impact it has in climate? So, yeah.
So thank you so much for those insights, because I think particularly Sphere C is where there's so much excitement, but also perhaps it's a little bit different than signing a check in Sphere B or working within your products in Sphere A. So we've got some time for some questions, and we've got some mics around somewhere. Do we have some mics? Yes, we've got mics at the back. So catch the lady with the mic's eye, and she has, well done.
Thank you so much. Founder of Creators for Climate. And we've just started working with Oxford Net Zero on the concept of serviced emissions and introducing that language. I just wondered, from your perspective, like, how do these concepts overlap? Because I think our work could be related to both.
I hand over to Kai, but absolutely the work that we've been doing, because of course you've got avoided emissions, you've got serviced emissions. One of the sectors for which the idea of spheres is very important is professional services. So Futerra is an agency. We do have a footprint. Bluntly, I am Futerra's footprint because I fly too much. So, but when you actually think about the advice that we give to our clients and what we're saying to them, that far outweighs the size of our actual, our direct footprint is smaller than your average primary school. And so for the professional services industry, whilst of course we must deal with our absolute emissions, if our absolute emissions are small, but we're advising companies in ways that increases their emissions, it's one of the breakthrough thoughts that actually has helped inspire thinking about spheres, of going, there are some industries for whom their spheres are going to be outweighted in terms of how important they are.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say my closest colleague, Alexis McGittern, has been leading the serviced emissions work. The guidance has come out as part of the Race to Zero, and it's been a collaboration across lawyers, marketing teams, just a whole range of professional services. It's been an incredible momentum behind it. And we developed those directly in parallel with the Spheres work, and we'll be working with that guidance as we roll out the sort of Spheres space for exploration, not new framework.
Thank you, Lucy. Other questions? Great.
Hello, my name is Mary Wilson. I'm the CEO and founder of Taza, and really love this concept of spheres, primarily because we're building an AI platform, yes, I said it, in which we are looking at the atlas of sustainability is how we've been framing it, and looking at how do we show the interconnectivity between industries and use cases and regulations. And so I really love this, and I guess I'm curious if there's been any thought already to how to leverage something that removes complexity, like AI, to achieve some of this interconnection, and how do we start engaging and using the technology platforms to bring all of those forces and enable them to move forward and build momentum.
What a brilliant question. From a spheres perspective, I think we could probably answer not yet, but that's because we've got as far down as spheres, subspheres, and we are not yet down at targets and what have you. But thank you so much, because we're absolutely going to need that, not least because we can't do all of this in Excel. Well, I'll be honest, a fair amount of it's in Excel at the moment, but we talked this morning about the importance of leveraging AI for managing huge amounts of data.
I think spheres also bring accountability to the grand claims I'm hearing about AI solving so much. And I think we are lacking a kind of products space to talk about and compare efforts there, and to call bullshit, in Anna's words.
We probably need maybe one very quick question, if we can get one very quick question at the front here. Down here? Lovely. Very quick though, because someone's waving. Shut up now.
I hope an easy one. Paul Simpson, what's the role of collaboration in winning the spheres?
We have a whole sphere category of Sphere C that is about these industry partnerships. And so, the Mission Possible partnerships, those would be sort of in Sphere B, the purchasing sphere. If you're kind of part of a demand aggregation coalition, that gets recognized, that hasn't been recognized. Companies go through these incredible processes to sign these partnerships in order to drive systemic impact, and it doesn't get recognized immediately in the inventory. So that was a huge part of the driver for us in developing the spheres.
So what's next? We are working on a white paper right now, which that slide that I showed you will be beautifully designed up and the wording will be finished. And we'll also have a whole set of examples to bring this to life. So what are the examples of what companies are already doing? We're not inventing examples, we're taking examples of what's already out there the companies are doing over that. We'll publish that quite soon. And we're working with a core group of pilot companies, both in Europe and North America, but also in South America and in Asia, who are working through testing the Spheres process much in the way that Oatly already has done, to kind of road test this, work out if it's possible, work out where the pain points are, work out where it's too much and where we need to dial up, or work out where it's possible for us to dial forward as well. So thank you so much for coming and spending your afternoon talking about this. You have had a sneaky peek of something that nobody else in the world has seen, including, if I may say, some of our partners. So there you go, you're front of it, and really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you. And thank you so much to Kaya and to Hannah and to Anna and to Caroline for coming up and being the brains trust on the sofa.